Hello and welcome to part 2 of making Navia from Genshin Impact. This video will primarily focus on making the boots for this costume. To make the boots, I used Anaelic's patterns and tutorials, which were honestly amazing. For anyone interested in buying the patterns, she does have them for sale on her shop, and I've included the link below. All her patterns only came in one size, so I did have to adjust the pattern to make sure it fit me. However, all her 3D print files, heat transfer vinyl files, were all able to be interchangeable regardless of the boot size. I did also deviate from the patterns at some points. For example, I made shoe covers instead of deconstructing and then reconstructing a shoe. The shoe covers from EVA foam compared to casting them out of a mould. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into making the boots. I started off with purchasing 2 pairs of affordable heels for the base. Because I couldn't choose online, so I got both. I chose to use the left pair as the elastic held onto my foot well when worn, and they were easy to walk in as well. I 3D printed the pieces with the settings on the screen. I then sandpapered the prints as smooth as I could by hand. For the gems, I sanded and buffed them before prepping them to make a silicone mould. I also hot glued the gems onto the base of the surface so they would stay still in the silicone and not float to the surface within the container. For the remaining prints, I prepared a acetone and wood filler paste to paint over the prints. Each piece needed multiple coats to be applied on to get a thick coat. Thankfully, each coat dried relatively quickly in between. After applying this coating, I then further sanded each piece to achieve a smooth finish. I also use this as an opportunity to experiment painting over the prints. As you can see, some of them were prepped differently. I then sprayed Rust-Oleum primer onto the prints and let dry. Once dry to touch, I sprayed 2 coats of gold spray paint onto the prints. After the mould was made, I removed the prints and poured blue dyed resin into the moulds. After 24 to 48 hours of curing, I began sanding and buffing them until smooth. I brushed off any resin dust and sprayed 2 coats of Rust-Oleum clear gloss. I then cut some mirror paper as backings to the gems for the casings and used resin glue to fix the gems to the casings. I then moved on to making the ankle bows. After preparing all the bow pieces, I sewed together the tie, the bow and the bow tails. I cut the excess fabric around each piece and clipped around the curves before turning it right sides out. I took my time clipping the curves as I wanted a nice smooth curve. I did the same for the bow leaves and the bow ties too. I then ironed all the pieces flat. Unlike what I did in this video, make sure you use a pressing cloth when ironing velvet. Iron the bow leaves together as the edges at a 1.5 inch seam allowance. Fold the bow leaves to get your desired effect and hand sew the bow tie right sides together whilst around the middle of the bow. Once hand sewn together, trim the excess fabric and flip right sides out. I then hand sewed the bow ties at the back of the bow and flipped the tie so the seam allowance was hidden. And we now have some very cute ankle bows. After letting the gold paint dry, I carefully hand painted black paint onto the 3D prints. Once they were dry, I super glued snap-on clips at the back of the prints and hand sewed the attaching clip onto the bow. I was really happy with how cute they looked. The next step was making a pattern for the boots. I wrapped my leg with glad wrap, then put tape all over. I wore a heel to get an accurate pattern, and I also wore the skirt to achieve the right length, plus a little extra. I drew a line down the centre of the boot, and drew notch lines to align the pieces. I then cut down the centre front of my leg. I cut down the centre back and cut the flat part of the heel pieces too. I traced around the foot sole on paper and added a 1 cm seam allowance. I also did the same for the heel, however I chose not to use this piece. I cut out the pattern pieces from the faux gold leather and put them aside. For the front lace piece, I traced 2 lace patterns onto a sheet of baking paper. I then cut out 2 mesh pieces and basted the mesh onto the pattern. I trimmed the lace pieces to size and used clips to hold in place. I zigzag stitched each piece of lace onto the mesh, then overlapped the other lace pieces and zigzag stitched them onto. For the other boot, I mirrored the overlapping of the lace trim to maintain the accuracy according to the character. Also, check how much lace I had after I finished this. I traced one side of the Glad Wrap shoe cover onto pattern paper. I added a 1 cm seam allowance and I removed a bit off the centre front for the mesh piece. I then cut out 4 pieces out of stretch velvet fabric, with 2 pieces being mirrored. After I cut out 4 shoe cover pieces, I pinned the mesh centre front on, then zigzag stitched it onto the back shoe pieces. The corner lace piece at the foot was really difficult to sew with my machine, so I hand sewed this piece in place. I pinned and sewed the lace along each side of the mesh using a zigzag stitch on the inner and outer side of the lace and trimmed the loose threads. I pinned and sewed a pretty lace detail to go on each side of the centre mesh. I sewed a zigzag stitch on the left edge and right edge of the lace trim. So in total, I did 4 zigzag stitches down the leg on each foot. For preparing the vinyl pieces, I used Anaelic's vinyl file, uploaded it to my Cricut, then my Cricut cut 2 mirrored pieces of black HTV vinyl. I then used these Cricut tool thingies to help peel off all the unwanted pieces from the heat transfer vinyl. I ironed on the heat transfer vinyl. After letting the vinyl cool, I carefully peeled the plastic sheet off, which was so satisfying. I accidentally broke the vinyl here. Lucky I kept some of the vinyl scraps and I was able to make a vinyl graft. Here is what the iron-on vinyl looks like on the boots. I then matched the calf edges to make sure the glitter vinyl seamlessly matched together and pinned together before sewing. I sewed the pleather sole onto the shoe cover. It slipped around a lot for the first one, so I base stitched the sole on the other shoe cover, which made sewing it a lot easier. I hand sewed the clips onto the shoe to attach the 3D prints. I moved on to modifying the patterns and sewing the black velvet details that sit under the gold thigh piece, and trimmed and clipped the seam allowance before flipping right sides out and ironing flat. I also cut out these knee decorations thingies for the knees. I did these whilst I was doing the bows. I sewed them together, flipped them right sides out, and then hand sewed them closed. I hand sewed the pleats in place and then hand sewed one side together. I hand sewed the pleats on the bows. I hand sewed the pretty knee decorations, and lastly I sewed the thigh bow ends together so they made a circle. I printed the garter file at 130%, which was a perfect fit for me. However, increasing the size did cut off part of the stencil, so I had to trace one side, then flip that traced piece of paper and tape it into place. I decided to keep this printed piece as a master copy and prepared a new sheet to trace over. Here is what the stencil outline looks like. I then cut out the unwanted shapes out using a hobby knife. After pinning and tracing the stencil on 5mm EVA foam, I carefully cut along the outlines. I went along with my small scissors and trimmed any overhanging foam pieces to neaten the edges. I then sanded over the edges using a Dremel to further smoothen the edges. I didn't have a heat gun, so I used a hairdryer to heat seal the foam. It's not the greatest, but it's better than nothing. The lower garter is heat sealed and is a lot darker in colour than the top one that isn't heat sealed. At the top and bottom joins, I hot glued the garter edges together, applied a paint primer coat, then applied 3 coats of gold spray paint. I used an invisible thread to anchor the gold garter onto the rest of the shoe. and literally on the night before the con, I finished sewing the garter onto ballerina tights. As you can see, I did try sewing on the garters to normal stockings, but they tore very quickly. So I cut the old stockings out. I couldn't really cut it off completely because it was sewn onto other parts of the shoes. So I kind of just cut out the majority and I sewed the ballerina tights. The ballerina tights were a lot stronger to use instead. Here are what the finished boots look like. With the tools that I had at the time, I'm overall happy with how they turned out. They did hold up for an entire day before the thread holding the garters to the stocking started to fall apart. They did start to fall apart at the awards ceremony, which is better than if it happened during judging. Like every project, there's always something to learn from. This is my first time learning how to make shoe covers, so that was really interesting to be able to learn how to do that. Anyway, thank you for watching this video and I'll see you in part 3.